The air at the Miller Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late October dust, cheap coffee, and the bitter scent of failure. It was 1978, and the Miller place was the third one that fall to go under the hammer in our county. Jedediah Stone stood near the back, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn canvas jacket, his knuckles scarred from a lifetime of wrestling with iron. He wasn't here to gawk or to pick over a neighbor's bones for a bargain. He was here for one thing, and it was sitting off by itself near a collapsing corn crib, looking like a forgotten monument to a bygone era. It was a Wagner WA-14, one of the first true four-wheel drive tractors to ever turn a furrow in this part of the country. It was a beast of a machine, articulated in the middle, with four massive, weather-cracked tires that were all the same size. The original yellow paint was mostly a memory, lost to decades of sun and snow, leaving a mottled canvas of rust and primer. The cab was a simple steel box, with more glass missing than present. To most, it was a 10-ton piece of scrap iron. To Jed, it was potential. Thinking of getting into the museum business, Jed? A slick voice cut through his thoughts. Jed didn't have to turn around. He knew that voice. It was Richard Sterling, owner of the new International Harvester dealership on the edge of town. Sterling was everything Jed wasn't. His boots were clean, his hands were soft, and his smile was as bright and artificial as the fluorescent lights in his showroom. Jed turned slowly, his gaze flat. "Afternoon, Richard." Sterling strolled over, his fancy cowboy boots crunching on the gravel. He gestured at the old Wagner with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Lord, I haven't seen one of these dinosaurs in years. My dad used to say they were built in a blacksmith shop. What's it got in it? An old Cummins, right? Parts must be impossible to find." "It's got what it needs," Jed said, his voice low and even. "Look, Jed," Sterling leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "I know you're a good farmer, you work hard, but you can't get ahead with relics like this. I just took in a trade on a 1486, barely 500 hours on the tack. I can get you in that tractor for a song. We'll work out the financing, zero down for a man with your reputation. Think of the productivity, air conditioning, a radio. You deserve some comfort." Jed looked from Sterling's polished face to the massive rusted hulk of the Wagner. He thought of his own farm, the one his grandfather had broken with a team of mules and his father had tamed with a Farmall M. Every piece of equipment in his shed, from his trusty John Deere 4020 to the old New Holland Baler, was paid for in full. Their paint was faded and their metal was scarred, but they were his. They didn't belong to any bank. "I don't borrow money for iron, Richard. You know that," Jed said. Sterling chuckled, a condescending sound that grated on Jed's nerves. "Still living in your daddy's world, huh? Jed, this is 1978. The game has changed. You gotta leverage. You gotta expand. Land prices are going through the roof. Corn's over $3 a bushel. The smart money is borrowing every dime the bank will give you and buying up steel and dirt. Guys who don't are gonna get left behind. It's simple economics." Jed's eyes narrowed. He saw the other farmers nearby, men he'd known his whole life, listening in. He saw the looks on their faces. Some were nodding along with Sterling. They were driving new tractors, farming more ground than their fathers ever dreamed of, all of it on the bank's dime. They looked at Jed and his 10-year-old 4020 and saw a man afraid of progress. "My economics are simple," Jed said, his voice hard enough to chip stone. "If I can't pay cash, I don't buy it." Sterling threw his hands up in mock surrender, a broad smile plastered on his face for the audience. "Suit yourself, old-timer. But when you're out here wrestling with this pile of junk while your neighbors are in the field making money, don't say I didn't try to help you." He clapped a farmer on the shoulder. "Now, Jim, about that new 1086 you were looking at." Jed turned his back on them, the chatter fading as he focused again on the Wagner. He ran a hand over the cold, pitted steel of the fender. He could feel the ghosts in the machine, the engineers who drew it up, the welders who laid the heavy beads on its frame. It was built with a simple, brutal honesty that new tractors, with their plastic consoles and complex electronics, just didn't have. Sterling saw a relic. Jed saw a foundation. He saw a powertrain built to last 1,000 years. He saw an engine that, with a little care, would pull until the earth stood still. The auctioneer started his rhythmic chant, moving down the line of equipment. Jed waited. He watched a brand new Ford pickup, barely a year old and surrendered in the bankruptcy, sell for more than it cost new. He watched plows and discs, still bearing the dealer's sticker, go for top dollar to farmers eager to expand. Finally, the auctioneer and the crowd moved to the forgotten corner where the Wagner sat. "All right, boys, what have we got here?" The auctioneer boomed, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. "A big old Wagner four-wheel drive. She's a bit rough, as you can see. We ain't tried to start it, so we're selling it as is." "Where is? Who'll give me $5,000 to start it?" "5,000 for this big horse?" Silence. A few snickers rippled through the crowd. Sterling, standing at the front, shook his head with a theatrical sigh. 5,000? How about three? $3,000, boys. You can't buy the tires for that. 3,000. More silence. Jed stood perfectly still, his face a mask. "All right, $1,000 then. $1,000 to take it home. Who'll give me 1,000? Jed's hand shot up. "I got 1,000 from Jed Stone. 1,000. Do I hear 1,500? 1,500 anywhere?" The auctioneer scanned the crowd. Sterling just smirked. No one was foolish enough to challenge the bid. "Sold, for $1,000 to Jedediah Stone." A murmur went through the crowd. It wasn't a murmur of congratulations. It was a mix of pity and ridicule. Jed had just paid $1,000 for a lawn ornament. As Jed walked to the clerk's trailer to pay his bill, he heard Sterling's voice carry across the yard. "Well," Sterling said loudly to the men gathered around him, "at least he paid cash for it." The men erupted in laughter. Jed ignored them. He signed the bill of sale, his hand steady, and tucked the crisp paper into his shirt pocket. He owned it. The laughter, the scorn, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the work ahead. Before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you folks out there a question. Have you ever owned a piece of iron, a machine that everyone else called junk, but you knew deep down in your gut that it had a soul, a machine you brought back from the dead when no one else thought you could? Drop a comment below and tell me what it was. I'd surely like to hear about it. Getting the Wagner home was the first challenge. It was too wide for any trailer he owned, so Jed had to road it the 12 miles back to his farm. He spent 2 hours just airing up the massive tires, the rubber stiff and cracked. He checked the fluids. The oil on the dipstick was a milky grey sludge, a sure sign of water contamination. The radiator was half full of rusty water. He drained a little diesel from the tank into a glass jar. It was cloudy and smelled stale. It was a mess, but nothing he hadn't seen before. He borrowed 2 heavy-duty truck batteries from a neighbor, the same one who had just bought the miller's nearly new disc, and hooked them up. He climbed into the Spartan cab, the seat springs shot, and turned the key. The starter groaned, a low, painful sound, like an old man trying to get out of a chair. It turned the big Cummins over once, twice, then gave up. Jed wasn't discouraged. He knew better than to just keep cranking. He spent the next hour with a set of wrenches, cracking the fuel lines and pulling the injectors. Just as he suspected, the tips were caked with carbon and varnish. He laid them out carefully on a clean rag. Then, with the injectors out, he hit the starter again. A geyser of rusty water shot out of each cylinder, spraying the underside of the hood. He kept cranking until only a fine mist of diesel came out. He'd cleared its throat. He took the injectors back to his shop and spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously cleaning them, soaking them in carburetor cleaner, and using a fine wire to clear the tiny holes in the tips. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the farmyard, he had them back in the engine. The fuel lines tightened down. He bled the system, pumping the small hand primer until his arm ached, and he heard the telltale squeal of air being pushed out of the return line. He climbed back into the cab, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The starter spun faster this time. The engine coughed once, a puff of white smoke billowing from the straight pipe exhaust. It coughed again, then caught. It sputtered and shook, the whole tractor vibrating violently. Then, with a deafening roar, the big Cummins came to life, spewing a thick cloud of black smoke that blotted out the setting sun. It settled into a rough, loping idle, but it was running. A slow smile spread across Jed's face. It was the first time he'd smiled all day. The next few weeks were a blur of grease and steel. Jed worked from sunup to sundown, nursing the Wagner back to health. He drained the milky oil from the engine, the transmission, and the differentials, gallons and gallons of it, replacing it with fresh, clean lubricants. He flushed the cooling system half a dozen times until the water ran clear, then filled it with proper antifreeze. He pulled the valve covers and adjusted the lash on every valve, his feeler gauges moving with practiced precision. The hydraulic system was weak, barely able to lift the big three-point hitch. He tore into the main pump, a massive gear-driven unit. He found the seals were shot and one of the main housing O-rings was brittle as plastic. Sterling was right about one thing: parts were hard to come by. No dealer stocked them. But Jed didn't need a dealer. He took the old seals to a specialty bearing and seal house in the city, and they matched them up. He spent a full day rebuilding that pump on his workbench, cleaning every part, lapping the gear housing with a fine abrasive to smooth out the scoring, and reassembling it with the care of a watchmaker. Every time a neighbor drove by, they'd slow down, shake their heads, and drive on. The talk at the co-op coffee shop was that Jed Stone had finally lost his mind. Paying good money for that rust heap, they'd say. He could have a new tractor for what he's spending on oil for that thing. Richard Sterling fueled the fire, telling anyone who would listen that Jed was a cautionary tale, a man stuck in the past, doomed to fail. Jed heard the whispers. He felt the stares. But he didn't care. He was in his element. He found a crack in the main articulation joint, hidden under a half-inch of greasy grime. He spent 2 days grinding it out, preheating the thick steel with a rosebud torch, and then laying in bead after bead of 70-18 welding rod, building it up stronger than new. He rewired the whole machine, tearing out the old frayed wires and replacing them with heavy-gauge cable, soldering every connection and covering it with heat-shrink tubing. Finally, the day came. It was late November, the ground just on the verge of freezing solid. He hooked his biggest chisel plow to the Wagner's drawbar, a heavy 9-shank implement that made his 40-20 grunt and slip in the tough clay ground. He climbed into the cab, the engine fired to life on the first touch of the key, and he eased the throttle forward. The tractor moved, the big tires biting into the corn stubble. He dropped the plow into the ground, and the big Cummins barely even noticed. The exhaust note deepened to a steady, powerful baritone, and a plume of clean black smoke rose from the stack as it settled in to work. Jed plowed all day and into the night, the tractor's rebuilt headlights cutting a swath through the darkness. The old Wagner pulled that plow deeper and faster than the 40-20 ever could. It didn't slip, it just gripped and pulled. The raw, unadulterated power of it was intoxicating. He was doing in one pass what used to take him two. He was saving fuel, saving time, saving wear and tear on his other machine. And the $1,000 tractor, the joke of the county, was doing it all. He finished his fall tillage 3 days ahead of schedule. As he drove the tractor back to the shed that final night, covered in dust and smelling of diesel, he passed Richard Sterling's new house on the hill. It was lit up like a Christmas tree. Through the big picture window, Jed could see Sterling and his wife hosting a party. The yard was full of new cars. Jed didn't feel a shred of envy. He just throttled the Wagner up, and the roar of the old Cummins engine echoed across the valley, a declaration of independence. The next few years seemed to prove Richard Sterling right. The late 1970s were a golden age for American agriculture, or so it seemed. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union was a distant memory, and now they were buying American wheat and corn with a bottomless appetite. Prices soared. Land that Jed's father had bought for $200 an acre was suddenly being appraised at $2,000, then $2,500. The banks, flush with cash from oil-rich nations, were practically begging farmers to take out loans. The mantra from the universities and the government was simple: get big or get out. Richard Sterling was the high priest of this new religion. His International Harvester dealership grew into a gleaming temple of red iron. He built a massive new showroom with floor-to-ceiling glass windows and a service bay so large you could fit 3 combines in it at once. He sold tractors, combines, and planters as fast as the factory could ship them. His customers were Jed's neighbors. They traded in their reliable, paid-for 66 and 86 series tractors for brand new 2+2s and 50 series Magnums, signing loan papers with interest rates that floated with the prime. Nobody seemed to read the fine print. The money was rolling in, and the party, it seemed, would never end. Sterling himself became a major landowner. He used the dealership's success as leverage to secure massive loans, buying up any farm that came on the market. He didn't farm it himself, not really. He hired young guys to run his fleet of brand new equipment, farming thousands of acres from the seat of a new Cadillac, a telephone receiver practically glued to his ear. He was a pillar of the community, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, the man everyone looked up to as the model of modern success. Meanwhile, Jed Stone kept on as he always had. He farmed his 320 acres, the same ground his family had worked for 3 generations. The high grain prices were good for him too, but he didn't use the windfall to buy more land or new equipment. He used it to pay off his operating note early each year. He built a new machine shed, paying the contractor in cash as the work was completed. He bought a newer, bigger grain bin, again paying cash. He stockpiled parts for his machines, filters, belts, bearings, injector pumps for the 4020, a complete set of seals for the Wagner's hydraulics. He was preparing, though he couldn't have said for what. It was just a feeling in his gut, a caution passed down from his father, who had survived the Great Depression. "Son," his father used to say, "the only thing that will sink a farmer faster than a drought is a banker's pen." The community's view of Jed solidified. He wasn't just old-fashioned anymore, he was a fool, a failure. He had a chance to become a millionaire, they whispered at the coffee shop, and he was letting it pass him by. Why wasn't he renting more ground? Why was he still driving that 10-year-old pickup truck? Why was he still wrestling with that old junk he called machinery? Sterling often used Jed as a punchline in his sales pitches. "You don't want to end up like old Jed Stone," he'd tell a young farmer wavering on, signing a note for a new combine. "He's gonna die on the same small farm his daddy did, with nothing to show for it but a shed full of obsolete iron." One afternoon, Jed was at the parts counter in Sterling's dealership, picking up a hydraulic filter for his 4020. Sterling saw him from his glass-walled office and sauntered out. "Jed, good to see you," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Keeping that old deer running, are you? You know, I've got a brand new 5288 on the lot, 4-wheel drive, 180 horsepower. We could have you in the field with it tomorrow. The bank is offering 10% interest right now. Can't beat it." "This filter is all I need today, Richard," Jed said, laying a $10 bill on the counter. Sterling shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "I just don't get you, Jed. I really don't. You're sitting on a gold mine, and you refuse to dig. Every other farmer in this county is doubling their net worth every year, and you're just standing still. It's a shame." Jed picked up his filter and turned to leave. He paused at the door and looked back at Sterling, standing there amidst the gleaming red paint and the smell of new tires. "There's a difference between net worth on a banker's paper and money in your pocket, Richard," he said quietly. "Paper can burn." He walked out, leaving Sterling shaking his head. That winter, the first signs of trouble began to appear, small cracks in the foundation of the boom. On the radio, the news was full of talk about inflation, about a new Federal Reserve chairman named Paul Volcker who was determined to break it, no matter the cost. Jed was in the grain elevator one morning when he overheard 2 young farmers talking. "Can you believe it?" one of them said. "The bank just sent me a letter. My operating note for next spring, the interest rate jumped from 9% to 12%. "Mine went to 13%, the other replied, his voice tight with worry. 13%? How are you supposed to make a crop pencil out with money costing that much?" Jed listened in silence. He thought of his own operating budget for the coming year. It was already planned out, written in a ledger book on his kitchen table. And at the bottom of the page, the line for interest payments was, as always, a simple, clean 0. That night, a blizzard blew in, covering the fields in a thick blanket of white. Jed stood in his machine shed, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The air was cold and smelled of diesel, grease, and cold steel. He looked at his machines, parked in neat rows. The Farmall H, the John Deere 4020, And in the biggest bay, the old Wagner WA-14, its massive frame and dull, rusted paint seeming to absorb the light. They were old, they were obsolete, but they were his, every last nut and bolt. Far off in the distance, through the swirling snow, he could see the bright yard lights of Richard Sterling's dealership, a beacon of progress and prosperity. But tonight, to Jed, it looked different. It looked fragile. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, a premonition that the easy times were over. The piper was about to come calling, and he was going to demand to be paid. The spring of 1981 broke hot and dry. The winter snows had been thin, a mere dusting that vanished in the first warm days of March, leaving the ground thirsty. Jed planted his corn into soil that felt more like powder than loam, the planter discs kicking up clouds of grey dust that hung in the still air. By May, the talk in town had turned from interest rates to the weather. The sky remained a hard, brilliant blue, day after day, week after week. The sun beat down with a relentless intensity, baking the clay fields into a cracked, pale mosaic. The young corn, which should have been knee-high and a deep, lustrous green, was stunted and yellowish, its leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, as if in prayer for a rain that never came. Jed watched his crop struggle, a familiar ache of worry in his gut. But he also watched his neighbors. They were farming more land than ever, vast tracts of rented ground, on top of the acreage they'd recently bought at inflated prices. Their new, massive planters had covered the ground in record time, but now their input costs were strangling them. The expensive hybrid seed, the tons of anhydrous ammonia injected into the soil, the chemical herbicides, all of it was a sunk cost, withering away under the brutal sun. Their operating notes, with interest now climbing past 15%, were ticking time bombs. One sweltering afternoon in June, Jed was cultivating his soybeans with the old 40-20, trying to conserve what little moisture was left in the soil. He saw a plume of dust on the road and watched as one of Richard Sterling's brand-new International 5488 tractors, pulling an enormous field cultivator, turned into the field bordering his own. It was driven by a young hired man Jed didn't recognize. The machine was a magnificent beast, its sleek red paint and silver stripes gleaming in the sun. The air-conditioned cab was a silent bubble of comfort against the oppressive heat. It made Jed's open station 40-20 look like a museum piece. The big tractor made 2 passes down the half-mile-long field, moving at an impressive clip, and then it stopped. Jed finished his row and watched. The hired man climbed out, kicked one of the huge rear tires, and then climbed back in. The engine revved, but the tractor didn't move. After a few more minutes, the young man got out again, this time with a look of panic on his face, and jogged toward the road. Jed throttled down the 40-20 and drove over to the fence line. "Trouble?" he called out. The young man, barely 20 years old and sweating through his shirt, looked relieved to see another human being. "I don't know what happened," he said, his voice cracking. "It was running fine, and then there was this bang, and it just quit pulling. The engine runs, but it won't move. The computer screen in the cab is flashing some kind of code." Jed nodded slowly. He knew enough about the new machines to know that a flashing code meant a call to the dealer. And a call to the dealer meant a service truck, a technician with a laptop, and a bill that would make a man's eyes water. "That's Sterling's new tractor, isn't it?" Jed asked. "Yeah, he's going to kill me. We're already behind on this ground." An hour later, Sterling's dealership service truck arrived. A mechanic in a clean uniform hooked up a diagnostic tool. Jed had finished his own field and was heading home, but he slowed as he passed. He saw Sterling himself pull up in his Cadillac, his face a thundercloud. Jed couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the gestures. The mechanic pointed at the rear of the tractor. Sterling threw his hands in the air. The problem was clearly internal, serious, and expensive. The next day, Jed heard the story at the co-op. The planetary gear set in the 5488's rear end had failed. It was a known weak point in the early models, a flaw in the pursuit of more power without strengthening the drivetrain to match. The parts alone were over $5,000, and with the labor to split the tractor and rebuild the rear axle, Sterling was looking at a bill approaching $10,000. Worse, the parts were on backorder. The magnificent new tractor, the symbol of modern efficiency, would sit idle for 3 weeks while the weeds took over the field and the sun continued to bake the life out of the soil. Jed thought of the massive, overbuilt planetary hubs on his old Wagner, designed for logging and construction work. He knew they would likely outlast the farm itself. The first deep cracks were showing, not in the dry earth, but in the fragile foundation of the new way of farming. The drought broke in late July with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened what was left of the corn and washed topsoil into the ditches. The harvest that fall was a disaster. Yields were less than half of what was normal. The price of corn, which should have risen on the news of a poor harvest, instead collapsed. A new grain embargo, this one a response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, had slammed the door on America's biggest customer. The market was flooded, and prices fell below $2 a bushel, well below the cost of production for most farmers. The winter of 1982 was grim. The chatter at the coffee shop was no longer about expansion and new equipment. It was hushed, fearful talk of bankers and balance sheets. The prime interest rate, the one that governed all their floating rate loans, had crested at an unbelievable 21%. Loan renewal notices arrived in mailboxes like death sentences. Men who had considered themselves wealthy landowners just 2 years prior were suddenly facing bankruptcy. The math was brutal and inescapable. Land they had bought for $2,500 an acre was now barely worth $1,000. Yet the loans remained. They were hopelessly upside down. Richard Sterling was hit harder than anyone. His dealership, once a hub of bustling activity, was now a ghost town. No one was buying new equipment. The service bays were full of broken-down machinery from farmers who couldn't pay their repair bills. Sterling had gambled everything on the idea that the boom would last forever. He had leveraged his dealership to buy thousands of acres of land at the peak of the market. Now, the banks that had once courted him were his executioners. Jed saw him one day at the post office. The confident, slick salesman was gone. In his place was a pale, gaunt man with dark circles under his eyes. His suit hung loosely on his frame, and his hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with his mail. He saw Jed, and for a moment his eyes flared with the old arrogance, but it died just as quickly, replaced by a look of weary desperation. He nodded curtly and walked away without a word. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the county newspaper like obituaries. First a few, then a dozen. These were not marginal farms, they were the operations of the progressive farmers, the ones who had followed Sterling's advice to the letter. Every notice was a story of a family losing land that had been theirs for generations. The auctions began again, but these were different from the Miller auction where Jed had bought the Wagner. The mood wasn't just sad, it was angry and desperate. Crowds gathered not to bid, but to protest, to form human chains around a neighbor's house, trying in vain to stop the sheriff and the man from the bank. Jed's farm survived. It wasn't easy. The low grain prices meant there was very little profit. He and his wife lived frugally, cutting back on every possible expense. But they were not in danger. With no debt payments, their cost of living was a fraction of their neighbors. Jed's strategy of stockpiling parts paid off. When the hydraulic pump on his 4020 finally gave out, he didn't have to order an expensive new one. He simply walked to his parts shelf, pulled out the rebuild kit he had bought 3 years earlier, and spent a winter afternoon in his warm shop putting it back together. While his neighbor's complex computer-controlled tractors sat idle waiting for expensive parts and technicians, Jed's simple, rugged machines kept running. The Wagner was his workhorse. He used its brute power to deep-rip his fields in the fall, shattering the hardpan created by the drought and allowing the winter moisture to penetrate deep into the soil profile. The engine never faltered, the transmission never slipped. It was a machine built for a harsher, less forgiving world, and it was perfectly at home in the harsh, unforgiving reality of the 1980s farm crisis. He was a man out of time, and it had saved him. The day came as Jed knew it must. A full-page ad appeared in the paper. Absolute auction, by order of the First National Bank, all assets of Sterling Farm and Implement. The date was set for a cold, grey Saturday in March. The temple was being dismantled. The crowd at the Sterling auction was massive, but they were mostly spectators. They came to witness the final spectacular collapse of the man who had personified the boom years. The rows of gleaming red tractors and combines, many with less than a few hundred hours on them, sat silent. The auctioneer's voice echoed off the big steel dealership building, but the bids were slow and painfully low. A 5488 Magnum, identical to the one that had broken down in the field, a tractor that had sold for over $100,000 just a few years before, sold for $25,000. The banker stood beside the auctioneer, his face grim, writing down the losing numbers in a small notebook. Richard Sterling was there, standing off to the side by himself, a ghost at his own funeral. He wore a simple work coat instead of his usual suit. He looked 10 years older. His wife wasn't with him. Jed watched him, not with satisfaction, but with a deep, profound sadness. Sterling wasn't an evil man. He was just a man who had believed too deeply in the promise of easy money, a man who had confused debt with wealth. Jed hadn't come to gloat. He had come for a specific reason. He waited patiently as the auctioneer worked his way through the prime equipment and moved to the older trade-ins and shop tools. Finally, they came to the land. Sterling's home farm, 240 acres of the best ground in the county, including the house on the hill that Jed used to see lit up at night. "All right, folks, here's the crown jewel," the auctioneer boomed, trying to inject some life into the somber crowd. 240 acres of prime bottom ground with a beautiful 5-bedroom executive home. "What'll you give me?" The banker started the bidding at $1,000 an acre. The bids came slowly, reluctantly. These were neighbors, men who had eaten at Sterling's table, and they were hesitant to pick over his bones. But the land was good, and the price was a fraction of what it had been. The bidding crept up to $1,200 an acre. Jed raised his hand. $1,300, the auctioneer called out, his eyes finding Jed in the crowd. A murmur went through the onlookers. Jed Stone, the man who never borrowed, was bidding on Richard Sterling's farm. Another farmer countered. $1,350. Jed didn't hesitate. $1,400. His voice was calm and steady. He had done the math. He had years of modest profits saved up, sitting in a simple savings account, earning a pittance in interest. He knew what the land was worth, not in the inflated dollars of the boom, but in its true, productive value. He knew exactly what he could afford to pay in cash. The bidding stalled. The other farmer shook his head and stepped back. The auctioneer looked around, his gaze sweeping the crowd one last time. $1,400 an acre. Going once. Going twice. Sold to Jedediah Stone for $1,400 an acre. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd, followed by a quiet buzz of respect. Jed had not only survived, he had prevailed, and he had done it on his own terms. He walked to the clerk's table and saw Sterling standing there, his face ashen. Jed pulled out his checkbook. He didn't write the check to the bank. He wrote it to Richard Sterling. It wouldn't be enough to cover all of Sterling's debts, not by a long shot, but the bank would have to deal with Sterling to get its money. It was a small gesture, a way of giving the man a final say in the dispersal of his own life's work. Sterling looked at the check, then at Jed. His eyes were filled with a confusion of emotions. Shame, resentment, but also a flicker of something else. Gratitude. "Why, Jed?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jed looked him square in the eye. "It's good ground, Richard. It deserves to be farmed by someone who respects it." He paused, then added, "The house is yours to live in for as long as you and your family need it. No rent, just keep an eye on the place for me." He turned and walked away before Sterling could respond, leaving the broken man holding the check, a lifeline he never expected from the man he had ridiculed for years. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm economy slowly healed. Jed farmed his original 320 acres and the new 240 with his trusted fleet of old iron. The Wagner, now with thousands of hours on its rebuilt engine, was his primary tillage tractor. Its rusted, mottled paint had become a familiar sight in the valley, a symbol of endurance. The community's perception of Jed had transformed completely. He was no longer the old-fashioned fool. He was the wise man, the survivor. Young farmers, wary of the banks that had ruined their fathers, now came to Jed for advice. They'd find him in his shop, wrench in hand, and he would patiently explain the intricacies of a diesel fuel system or the proper way to set a plow. He never preached, but his lesson was clear in everything he did. Own what you have, understand how it works, and never let a man in a suit convince you that a signature is the same as a harvest. Richard Sterling and his wife stayed in the house on the hill for 2 more years before moving to the city to live with their daughter. The day he left, he stopped his car at the end of Jed's lane. Jed was out by the shed, greasing the articulation joint on the Wagner. Sterling got out and walked over, his hands in his pockets. "I never properly thanked you, Jed," he said, his voice quiet. Jed wiped his hands on a rag. "Nothing to thank me for. You'd have done the same." Sterling managed a weak smile. "No, I wouldn't have. That's the difference. I thought the game was about numbers on a page. You knew it was about this." He gestured to the land, the machines, the farm itself. "You were right all along." They shook hands, 2 men who had been on opposite sides of a painful history, and Sterling drove away. One crisp fall afternoon, almost 20 years after the Sterling auction, Jed stood in the machine shed with his grandson, a boy of 16 with bright, curious eyes and a dusting of grease on his cheek. They were changing the oil on the Wagner. The boy looked up at the massive, ancient machine, its frame scarred and welded, its tires cracked with age. "Grandpa," he asked, "why do we keep this old thing? We could afford a new tractor now, a nice one with a GPS and everything." Jed stopped turning the wrench and looked at the boy. He dipped a finger in the stream of old black oil draining from the engine's sump and rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling for grit, for any sign of trouble. "This tractor," Jed said slowly, his voice raspy with age, "is more than just iron. In 1978, everyone in this county told me it was junk. They laughed at me for buying it. They were all buying new machines, big shiny tractors with radios and air conditioning, all on the bank's money. They called it leverage. They said I was being left behind." He pointed with the wrench towards the land that used to be Sterling's. "That farm over there, and 5 others in this valley, were lost because of that kind of thinking, not because the men who farmed them were lazy or stupid. They were good farmers. They just forgot the most important rule. You can't farm with a banker's pen." When the hard times came, and they always come, their beautiful new tractors were the first things to go. The payments ate them alive. He patted the huge fender of the Wagner, the metal cool and solid beneath his hand. "But this old girl, she was ours. She didn't have a payment book. When she broke, we fixed her right here in this shop. She asked for nothing but fuel, oil, and a little respect. She pulled us through the storm when everyone else was sinking." He looked his grandson in the eye, his gaze intense. "Don't you ever forget that. It's not about having the newest or the biggest. It's about being the master of what you have. This rust, these scars." He ran his hand over a thick weld he'd laid himself decades ago. "This is our family's history. It's the story of how we survived. This isn't junk. This is freedom." The boy looked from his grandfather's weathered face to the old tractor, seeing it now not as a relic, but as a monument. He picked up a clean rag and began to wipe the grease from the massive engine block, his movements careful and deliberate, understanding at last the weight and the wisdom of the rusted iron. The setting sun cast a golden light into the shed, illuminating the floating dust motes and glinting off the old Wagner, the obsolete machine that had quietly, steadfastly held the line.